Now, I told you guys, and I'll say it again. A lot of these rules, the laws and policies that have been applied to Black Americans eventually makes its way to poor and lower income white people too, even though it wasn't meant for you. There was a video that went viral on Twitter. And I'm so glad that it did, because I said, here's another example that I can show the Sabby fam. Everybody in the audience, first of all, raise your hand if you have been a server, waitress, whatever you want to call it. Raise your hand if you've been a server. I waited tables, whether it was college, whatever you did, your jazz. If you've done that, put a 1 in the chat. That's you. You got a 1. You waited tables. A lot of us probably have at some point, right? So then you're familiar with tipped wage. And you're familiar that some states in this country still pay $2.13 an hour to servers because they use the excuse that you receive tips, which isn't always true. Raise your hand if you ever been stiffed. Ouch. It happens. So a lot of you, a lot of ones in the chat coming through. See? Yeah. A lot of them coming through. All right. So that being said, someone put a 0. All right. That being said, you guys know I have argued for quite some time that I wish we were able to do what some European countries do, which is to just pay servers a living wage so they don't have to rely on tips. But that's not where we are. There have been a couple of ballot measures in this country this past year, 2024, that had that on the ballot. It was on the ballot here in Massachusetts to increase the tipped wage. It did not pass here because a lot of people that own the mom and pop restaurants said we can't afford to pay everybody that. This is what happens when you wait this long to get it right. That's not on them. That's just on the system in this country. I want to show you this video of where this all began. Did you ever wonder why the wage was so low to begin with? This is the video that is going viral. And it is really important that you understand why the tip wage is so low in the first damn place. Check this out.
Racism is the reason tipping culture is so out of hand in the US, and it's why people can still be legally paid $2.13 an hour. After the Civil War and the end of slavery, Black workers who were formerly enslaved were usually only able to get service jobs. Racist employers looking to exploit labor found a way to avoid paying Black people any wages at all. They decided that customers could just tip them for their services instead of paying them themselves. From there, the use of tipping to pay workers became more and more common. Before the Civil War, tipping in the US was rare, and it definitely wasn't used to pay someone's entire wage. Then in the early 1900s, a bunch of employers who wanted to keep labor costs down and prevent workers from organizing formed the National Restaurant Association. Since then, they've lobbied Congress to exclude tipped occupations from minimum wage protections and later to establish a lower sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. That's why today, the federal minimum wage for tipped employees is just $2.13 an hour. Tipped workers are 2.3 times more likely to live in poverty than non-tipped workers, and they're more likely to be people of color, women of color, or single parents. They're also disproportionately born outside of the US. Tipping is still used as a way to exploit workers, squeeze more out of customers, and keep people, especially Black and brown people, in poverty.
One more again, and we're going to pause halfway through. Listen.
Racism is the reason tipping culture is so out of hand in the US, and it's why people can still be legally paid $2.13 an hour. After the Civil War and the end of slavery, Black workers who were formerly enslaved were usually only able to get service jobs.
Pause. So after slavery ended, remember, it's not like, okay, all of a sudden Black people are like, yay, all these jobs are for us. No, that's not the way it worked. In fact, there were certain codes. We'll get to that in just a second. Most of these jobs that were available for freed slaves were those types of jobs, the serving jobs, right? I'm saying this because especially white people that are watching me, follow me with this because I'm trying to prove a point. Those jobs were really not meant for white people to have. When people bring up these things and they say, well, how is it that, there's poor white people in the United States. How did that happen? That really wasn't supposed to be a thing, but it was slavery that made that a thing. We'll get to that in just a second. It is always important when you look at like some of these laws and rules that we have in this country, it is always important to go back in history and find out how did we get here? And the reason why a lot of these states in the US still have the tipped wage at $2.13 an hour is because that is what it was for freed slaves back in the day. One of the cheapest labor. They didn't really want to pay them much. And here we are still today. Well, she goes on to bring up the Restaurant Association.
Employers looking to exploit labor found a way to avoid paying Black people any wages at all. They decided that customers could just tip them for their services. And
you see that? That's where it came from. So, oh, well, you know what? They're freed, but we don't really want to pay them anything. We never want them to get to the point to where we are. So what we're going to do is we're going to make things more difficult for them economically. We're not going to give them the type of pay that you're getting. So let's just allow people to tip them. Now, as you can imagine, at that point in time, they probably weren't getting as much tips. Thus, it makes you stay in poverty. Thus, it is harder for you to get out of that cycle. And it is going to be more difficult for you to try to generate some type of generational wealth.
Instead of paying them themselves. From there, the use of tipping to pay workers became more and more common. Before the Civil War, tipping in the US was rare, and it definitely wasn't used to pay someone's entire wage. Then in the early 1900s, a bunch of employers who wanted to keep labor costs down and prevent workers from organizing formed the National Restaurant Association.
There we go again with they wanted to prevent workers from organizing. Doesn't that sound familiar? Don't you still hear people talking about that today? TYT, stand up. We know you were union busters. I mean, don't you still hear people talking about this today, how they wanted to prevent workers from organizing? That's still a thing. So the National Restaurants Association were like, no.
Since then, they've lobbied Congress to exclude tipped occupations from minimum wage protections and later to establish a lower sub-minimum wage for tipped workers.
Notice what she said. The National Restaurant Association, they lobbied Congress. So they had a hand in politics.
That's why today, the federal minimum wage for tipped employees is just $2.13 an hour. Tipped workers are 2.3 times more likely to live in poverty than non-tipped workers. And they're more likely to be people of color, women of color, or single parents. They're also
And we went through all of that. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I worked in the restaurant industry, and a lot of us did this like when we were, in college, that type of stuff. And you meet everybody, like especially a lot of the college students, we need a job, we need some money and all that kind of stuff. So typically we would wait tables because those jobs were available in the evening, that type of thing. But in doing that, I met people who were waiting tables full time. And I mean people that had families. I'm talking about women that were in their 40s, 50s, etc. There was a man that waited tables with me at Outback Steakhouse that was in his 60s. Why does anyone in this country in their 60s have to stand on their feet for all those hours throughout the day, carrying heavy trays, waiting tables at that point in life? And people of all different colors that participate in that job force. It's one of the easier jobs that you can get because they're going to train you. If you've never carried a tray before, they train you how to do it. So we need to see how this rule after slavery, how this went on to impact poor and lower income white people too. As I said before, if you go back then, you have to remember who usually had those jobs. Those serving jobs were usually for those who were Black, like people who were freed slaves, who took care of the kids. Think about these things. Who were the nannies? Who were the servers? Who were the waiters? And we'll get to why there was that divide among white workers in just a second. But I take you to this other example, which I continue to bring up on the show, and that was the example of healthcare. What is done to us eventually makes its way to lower income and poor white people. Tom Hartman brought up the issue with why we don't have health care for everybody in this country. Listen to this.
In 1887, Germany got the world's first single-payer healthcare system. Hoffman came over to the United States and got a gig as vice president of the Prudential Insurance Company. And in 1896, he published a book called Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro. And his argument was that black people were genetically inferior, and therefore, if we simply denied them health care, eventually, within a few generations, all black people would die out, and this would solve the race problem in America. His book was one of the best-selling books in America from 1896 to around 1930. He testified before Congress dozens of times. He testified before all kinds of states. Prudential put him on a nationwide tour. He was the reason why Harry Truman's effort at single-payer health care was shot down. He was the reason why FDR's effort at single-payer health care was shot down. And he was long dead in 1965 when Medicare came along, but his teachings were actually cited as one of the reasons why there's a 20% hole in Medicare, so that poor people, read that in the South as poor black people, won't show up at the hospital and wouldn't thus integrate the doctor's office.
Did everybody hear what Tom Hartman just said? So we all know that when it comes to healthcare, of course, there are the health insurance companies. They lobby, they pay the politics. We get it. We all know that. Or those of us that are really engaged in politics are aware of that. But a lot of people don't know what Tom Hartman just told you. Another reason why we don't have health care for everybody in this country, because they didn't want black people to have it. Now, that didn't just end up impacting black people. That also affected poor white people. So this is why I continue to say that race is class and class is race. When people tell you don't focus on race, just focus on class, they are excluding a part of yourself. If you are poor and you are white and people say, oh, don't focus on, they're excluding everything I just showed you. They are excluding where the tipped wage comes from. They're excluding why you don't have universal health care in this country. These are things you need to know. This is not to make anybody feel guilty. Sometimes people hear these stories and they're like, oh, I feel guilty now. This is not to make anybody feel guilty, okay? This is to tell you the history of where these things come from, so that you can understand how we got here. And that is always important. Now, I want to show you this. When we go back to these codes, this is why you were only able to get certain jobs. So people have to remember, after slavery ended, yes, there were black codes. A lot of times people don't want to talk about this. People just go with the story and say, yeah, the slaves were free and that's it. Abraham Lincoln freed everybody and whoop-de-doo. But they don't go into this part. Black codes were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and ensure their ability as a cheap labor force. After slavery was abolished during the Civil War, everybody see how this all ties back into labor. This is very important. Even though the Union victory had given some 4 million enslaved people their freedom, the question of freed black people's status in the post-war South was still very much unresolved. Under black codes, many states required black people to sign yearly labor contracts. If they refused, they risked being arrested, fined, and forced into unpaid labor. Does everybody understand this? And see, because of the 13th Amendment, remember, slavery is still legal under the 13th Amendment. That's why you have prisoners that work for free. These are all the things that people need to know and understand. So black codes definitely impacted your ability to establish any type of generational wealth in this country. You were limited to the types of jobs that you could have. Now, again, like I said, back then, they didn't realize that this was going to affect white people too. Then there's this part right here. The passage of black codes. Even as former enslaved people fought to assert their independence and gain economic autonomy during the earliest years of Reconstruction, white landowners acted to control the labor force through a system similar to the one that had existed during slavery. Does that sound familiar? The railroad workers that came onto the show. Don't you guys see how they still are trying to control the workers? They tell the workers you can't take any days off. The railroad workers, they wouldn't even allow them to go on strike. You see how the government came in and intervened and said, no, no, no. A lot of the railroad workers are white. So do you see how this later on impacted white people too? This is important. And then there's this part here about Mississippi, which I think people need to hear. To that end, in late 1865, Mississippi and South Carolina enacted the first Black codes. Mississippi's laws required Black people to have written evidence of employment for the coming year each January. If they left before the end of the contract, they would be forced to forfeit earlier wages and were subject to arrest. And then we fast forward to the wealth gap. Because now that I've told you all that, I want you to understand why this gap is still so huge today. 160 years of the Black-white wealth gap. See this? From 1860 to 2020. They stopped at 2020 for some reason. I don't know why, but here we are. The wealth gap between white and Black Americans is nearly as large today as it was in the 1950s. Highlighted for the friend in the back. Things have not improved. The wealth gap between white and Black Americans is nearly as large today as it was in the 1950s. That tells you, as a community, we have not moved forward. As a community, we are not getting ahead. There may be Black individuals here and there that, you know, they were able to make it out of poverty and did the damn thing. You can name them. LeBron James, right? You can name Ben Carson and all that kind of stuff. You can name individuals, but as a unit, as a community, we have not moved forward. And that is because of everything that I just told you. So if you see this, you have to understand that when you look at this, are we ready to go to, let's go to that screenshot, Eric. I want to show people that screenshot. We're going to go to the screenshot and then we're going to go to the race to the unequal opportunity race, because I want to show you where we sit right now when it comes to income. And I think that's one of the things that people just may not realize. A lot of times people point to individuals that did well, great. But as a community, we have not. You look at other communities and you'll see this right now. When you look at other communities, we'll look at other groups. Median household income in the United States in 2023. So they don't have 2024 yet. We'll get there. I want you to see something. Who's at the top? Now, when we scoot down here, Asian alone is in the lead. Asian Americans are in the lead. White alone, not Hispanic, are second. So white people aren't even first now. Everybody see that? Hispanic they're third. It says Hispanic of any race, third. Income, 65,000. White alone, 89,000. Asian alone, over 100,000. And then when you get down here, you'll see similarities. American Indian and Alaskan Native Unknown. So indigenous people, 57,000 a year. Black alone, 56,000 a year. We are still last. We are still at the bottom. Nothing has changed for us. Other people have moved around. Everybody see how this is happening? If you look here, you'll see white people are not in the lead anymore. Hello, my white viewers. You ain't in the lead no more. So do you see how now Asian Americans are now in the lead? White Americans, you are second. Hispanic Americans are third. So even Hispanic Americans are ahead of Black Americans with income. My people, we have not moved ahead. We have stayed at the bottom. At the bottom. No shade to the white folks, but I'm just letting you know you ain't elite no more. I think you need to see that. Things have changed. And now people have conversations and stuff about immigration and that type of thing, right? And I'm not anti-immigration, but look at this. So you can see Asian Americans today, I would say their parents or their grandparents, most likely their parents, may have immigrated to the US. Okay, so they are in the lead here. And then Hispanic Americans, like all my friends that are Latino, their parents immigrated to the US. So do you see a pattern? Okay, so we move on here to Altadena. Black Americans in Altadena impacted by the wildfires. And this is the community that I've been wondering about. A historic Black community reduced to ashes. The toll on generational wealth. Systemic insurance challenges. Everything I just told you guys, this was a historic Black community. It is now gone to ashes. So what happens here? How do they rebuild their generational wealth? How do they get their homes back? There have been multiple groups in this country that have had, I want to go ahead and share this as well, that have had to deal with disadvantages, that have had to deal with discrimination. But one thing I got to tell you that people need to understand after everything I just showed you, when people say people of color and all these other groups, you have to understand all those other groups didn't have to go through what I just showed you. All those other groups didn't have Black codes. All those other groups weren't just told, no, you can only move within certain spaces. You can only have these particular jobs. You can only be a server. They didn't have these things. All those other groups, most of them came over here after the civil rights work had already been done. So Black Americans made it easier for you to come here. So that's why it really hurts me when I do see other groups that come here and they talk down on Black Americans and tell us we have no culture and we don't have anything. You have to understand that the reason why you get to come here is because of the civil rights movement and the work that was done. And none of those other groups, when we talk about it, as much as you want to hear, you hear the ADL and APAC and all saying like, oh my God, we're threatened and they're coming after us and et cetera, et cetera. What you have to understand is they do not have the same history that Black Americans do in the United States. And you're going to see that right now. And you watch this video and you tell me if these other groups had all these same barriers that Black Americans did. I don't think they did. This is called the unequal opportunity race. A teacher showed this to her students and she was reprimanded for showing her students the truth. I'm no longer in education. I no longer work in education, so I don't have students anymore. So I'm going to show you the truth. This is what we came from. What you see here, this clock that's ticking, those are the years that are going by. So as you can see, their white counterparts, they already took off in the race. So Black Americans are waiting for their chance to run. And so now it's 1617. That's generational wealth being passed down. Now, remember what I told you about the employment, right? So they started the race. They get to take off in 1964 to start running. And they're talking about now underemployment. Remember what I told you about the server positions earlier on. So they're trying to catch up. Standardized test. See that? The old boy network. So these are his connections, right? Now, some of you may be wondering again, how did this fit in with poor white people? Because see, poor white people didn't have to deal with like the segregation, right? Because they still had the opportunity. They were still living in like when we had Jim Crow, you still lived on the white side of town. So that type of thing. But some of the things that happened that were done to Black Americans, the reason why you ended up having poor white Americans, I told you earlier in this segment, was because of slavery. Remember, there were those that owned land and those that did not. And one of the ways to distinguish between white Americans was to basically put this scold on white people that did not own property, white people that didn't own land. Now, they didn't put you in the same category as the slaves, but they still saw you as less than them. So you were still able to enjoy some of the same opportunities because you were white, just like they were. But they still tried to find ways to remind you of where your place was as well. This is why I want you to make the connection between race and class. This is why I continue to tell you when someone says just focus on class, there is no just focus on class. The majority of Black Americans are working class. And a lot of the economic issues that you see today that affect labor, all these workers that you see that are fighting for like union rights and just want to unionize, you go back to the National Restaurants Association where they wanted to prevent just that. They didn't want these Black workers to unionize. So now you white workers don't get to unionize. You can't separate the two. They are connected. So think about this. The next time you see a server, especially if you don't tip, if you don't tip, you should be tipping. But think about that. That's where it all comes from. A lot of these things that they tried to do to us eventually made its way to poor white people. Now, you still get the benefit of not having to deal with maybe being shut out of certain areas because of the color of your skin, etc. You don't have to deal with being hassled by the police just because. You don't have to deal with those kind of things. But it was never meant for it to be that way in the first place. So it all goes back to slavery. So you take away slavery, and a lot of these things don't happen. Make sure you share this with a friend. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.